Thanks. Hey, folks. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Jayanti Owens as a speaker today. Dr. Owens is a graduate of Princeton Sociology and Population Program, and so it's my pleasure to welcome you back. She comes equipped with her OPR mug. Dr. Owens is currently the Mary Teft and John Hazen White Senior Assistant Professor of Sociology and International and Public Affairs at Brown, and a recipient of the William T. Grant Foundation Scholar Award. Dr. Owens' work in part focuses on these social contexts, such as schools, families, at the workplace, and how the race, ethnicity, and gender of individuals in both positions of power and subordinated positions shape evaluations of individuals in these contexts in ways that contribute to disparities in both educational and economic outcomes along racial, ethnic, and gender lines. This current work critically examines the influence of institutions on individuals by examining how institutional features such as diversity and difference shape the psychological processes of individuals, with particular attention to implications for racial, ethnic, and gender inequality. Today, Dr. Owens will be sharing some work focusing on the context of educational institutions in a talk titled Double Jeopardy, Teacher Biases, Racialized Organizations, and the Production of Racial Ethnic Disparities in School Discipline. So please welcome Dr. Jayanti Owens.
Hi, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here today. I'm wondering if you can see my screen, which you may not be able to. Let me try this one more time.
All good. Oh, wait, it disappeared.
Okay, tell me if you can see it now.
Yes, good.
Okay, great. And you're seeing just the slides.
Correct.
Okay, great. Okay, wonderful. Well, I am so delighted to be here today, and so thankful to Jason for that really kind and thorough introduction. This is really a homecoming of sorts for me. And before I dive in, I want to just take a moment to acknowledge the many people at Princeton who have deeply impacted this work and my development over the years. It seems particularly fitting in this moment to also pay tribute to the late and great Sarah McClanahan, with whom I had the pleasure of collaborating. A paper I wrote with Sarah recently using the Fragile Families data was actually a direct inspiration for the work I'm going to share today. So before I dive into this specific paper, I just want to share a little bit about how the work I'm going to talk about today fits within my broader agenda. So broadly, my work is about education, social demography, and inequality. I'm interested in, as Jason said, how the race and gender of individuals and organizational contexts shape evaluations of behavior and the consequences of these evaluations for individuals' educational attainment and employment outcomes. In one line of work, I focus on factors shaping the social spread of ADHD diagnoses and their consequences for educational opportunity. In a second line of work, I focus on gendered returns to behavioral skills in the context of education and hiring. And in a third line of work, I focus on racial bias and evaluation of children's behaviors and how these behaviors can help explain racial disparities in school discipline. So today I'm going to be sharing a piece from this third line of work. So some of you might be wondering, what is school discipline and why is it relevant for demographers? So suspension and expulsion, what I refer to as discipline, involves the removal of a student from the classroom learning environment due to a behavioral infraction. Now, 99% of assigned sanctions are suspensions, and of those, the overwhelming majority are for mild infractions, things like defiance or non-compliance or disrespect, which have the largest amount of discretion on the part of teachers and administrators, and thus the greatest room for bias. We also know that today there's really large racial disparities in school discipline. So of the roughly 7 million youth who were suspended or expelled in the single 2013-14 academic year alone, Black boys were 3 times more likely to be suspended or expelled than white boys, and Latino boys were 1.3 times more likely. We also know that school discipline is linked to pretty significant cumulative disadvantage over the life course. So suspension and expulsion are linked to higher rates of interaction with the criminal justice system, and the negative labeling and loss of instruction associated with discipline are linked to lower achievement, higher risk of school dropout, and lesser educational attainment. But in spite of these really important implications, we don't fully understand what causes these racial disparities in discipline. I argue that discipline disparities emerge from teachers perceiving Black boys as being more blameworthy than white boys for the same misbehavior, and from teachers in schools with a critical mass of minority students being more blaming of all students than teachers in predominantly white schools. So what I mean by blameworthiness is teachers' attributions about the extent to which the student is at fault for the behavioral incident versus external factors outside of his or her control. I also want to clarify that when I refer to minority schools, what I'm referring to are schools that have a critical mass of Black and Latinx students, which I differentiate from segregated white schools, those that have, say, at least 65% white students. So scholars have put forward three main explanations for the racial gap that we see in school discipline today. The first explanation is about behavior differences, which is really a deficit-based explanation that emphasizes Black and Latinx students' higher levels of antisocial behaviors, aggression, and delinquency as compared to white students. Now, this explanation has been extensively investigated in prior research and has been found to explain very little of the Black-white or the Latinx-white gap in discipline. As such, the work that I'm taking up today explores the remaining two explanations, both of which operate net of behavior differences. So the second explanation is differential treatment, which is a mechanism of discrimination whereby Black and Latinx students are punished more harshly for comparable behaviors as white students at the individual teacher or administrator level. Now, this explanation has gained empirical support, but most work does not disentangle teachers' decisions about office disciplinary referral from the final sanctions that are assigned by school administrators, nor does it disentangle what I refer to as blaming bias, the idea that, for example, a Black and a white boy may both throw a pencil in class, but the Black boy may be perceived as being more blameworthy for that behavior, from what I refer to as referral bias net of perceived blameworthiness, which is the idea that a Black and a white boy may be perceived as being similarly blameworthy, but the Black boy may nonetheless be referred to the principal's office more readily. Now, this type of referral bias net of perceived blameworthiness may occur, for example, because of things like differences in teacher beliefs about parental intervention or about their own ability to control the classroom following the incident. So I bring this concept of perceived blameworthiness into the education literature from the literature in criminology. And the third explanation is between school sorting. This is really a segregation-based explanation whereby Black and Latinx students' higher rates of discipline arise from their disproportionately attending minority schools, which are more punitive to all students on average, for example, because of things like the presence of zero tolerance policies in minority schools or differences in teacher and administrator staffing. Now, this explanation has also gained empirical support, but prior work hasn't disentangled the effects of what I refer to as an organization level blaming predisposition, the idea that teachers in minority schools may perceive all students as being more blameworthy for throwing a pencil in class as compared to teachers in segregated white schools, from what I refer to as an organization level referral predisposition, the idea that teachers in minority and white schools may perceive that pencil throwing as being equally blameworthy, but that teachers in minority schools may refer students of all races to the principal's office more readily, for example, because of the things like the zero tolerance policies or staffing differences that I mentioned earlier. So I really care about sort of disentangling these mechanisms because of the different implications that they have for policy intervention. And I'm happy to talk sort of more about that during the Q&A. So to make this more concrete, let's look at a model of the discipline process. So when a behavioral incident occurs, it instigates a pipeline of potential events, which can ultimately end with the assignment of a suspension or expulsion by a school administrator. Now, most research examines the ultimate sanctions assigned by school administrators. However, I argue in this work that teachers are really powerful but often overlooked frontline actors in schools because they're the ones that are most likely to witness the behavior firsthand on the ground and to decide whether or not to assign blame to the student for that behavior, and because they ultimately decide on whether or not to refer the student to the principal's office. So today we're going to be focusing on the role of teachers in their office disciplinary referral decisions, which is a really important gateway event, but which is often less studied than the research on discipline. Now, in other work, I also focus on administrators, and I'm happy to also talk about that after the talk if people are interested. Okay, so there's been two small-scale studies that show that teachers' perceptions of students' behaviors are shaped by students' race ethnicity. But neither existing study asked teachers whether they would refer the student to the principal's office, making it difficult to tease apart the mechanisms of perception and treatment net of perception that I just talked about. The two small scale studies that do exist show that student race shapes individual teacher evaluations of misbehavior, for example, because of individual teachers' racial biases, which can reflect broader racial stereotypes in society. So I sharpen this work by focusing on perceived blameworthiness, which has been shown in the criminology literature to be a crucial component of racial biases. Now, when we think about sort of the role of school composition, there's been prior observational studies using large-scale data that have shown that minority schools are on average more punitive net of student behavior. Again, think about those zero tolerance policies. But the specific mechanisms through which organizations can intensify punishment is unclear. And importantly, no prior experiments situate teachers in their school organizational contexts to be able to disentangle the mechanisms at both levels. So in this work, what I'm doing is I'm situating teachers in their school organizational context to disentangle the mechanisms of disparity in office referrals at both the level of the individual teacher and at the level of their school organizational context. So the approach that I take is that I use original data from the first video vignette experiment with a nationally representative sample of teachers. I find that Black boys face a double jeopardy. At the individual teacher level, they're viewed as being more blameworthy for identical misbehavior as white boys. And at the organizational level, they disproportionately attend schools in which teachers view students of all racial ethnic backgrounds as being more blameworthy for identical misbehavior as students in white schools. Because minority students are more likely to attend these types of minority schools with greater blaming predispositions towards all students, this also contributes to racial disparity at the population level. Now, in reality, few white students attend minority schools. However, the random assignment of the videos of students to schools provides a really powerful counterfactual. It shows that if white boys were to attend the same schools as minority students, they too would be suspended at higher rates. So this is not about differences in student behavior, but about differences in their school organizational contexts, in addition to differences in student race. So I think this work has important implications across a range of evaluative contexts. So even though I am focusing on the case of teachers evaluating students in schools, I think that the findings really do have implications for a range of contexts, including police evaluating potential suspects, managers evaluating employees, medical providers evaluating patients, and even judges evaluating defendants. So ultimately, what the study does is it helps disentangle the contributions of these individual and organizational processes, net of differences in student behavior, with implications for helping identify the appropriate points for policy intervention. So first are the individual level hypotheses. In the top left quadrant, I have individual blaming bias, which is the process whereby a Black or Latino student may be perceived as being more blameworthy than a white student, in particular I'm focusing on boys, for throwing a pencil in class, so only the Black or Latino boys refer to the principal's office. Now, blaming bias, as I mentioned, may arise because of a larger set of negative racial stereotypes about the aggression, threat, or danger posed by Black or Latinx boys. In the bottom left quadrant is individual referral bias, which is the process whereby a Black or Latino boy may be perceived as being similarly blameworthy for identical misbehavior as the white boy, but nonetheless be referred to the principal's office more readily, for example, because of differences in teacher assumptions about the likelihood of parental intervention or their own ability to control the classroom following the incident, or even beliefs about the student's future misbehavior. Next, we move on to the organization level hypotheses. So in the top right quadrant is the organizational blaming predisposition hypothesis, whereby teachers in minority schools may perceive students of all racial ethnic backgrounds as being more blameworthy than do teachers seeing the exact same behavior in white schools. Now, teachers' organization level blaming predisposition may emerge because of differences in school policies, like the greater prevalence of zero tolerance policies in minority schools, or differences in teacher staffing across schools. So policy or staffing differences may lead teachers in minority schools to make implicit assumptions about the type of student being served, which can make them more sensitized to misbehavior. And finally, in the bottom right quadrant is the organization referral predisposition hypothesis, whereby teachers in minority schools may perceive students of all racial ethnic backgrounds as being similarly blameworthy for identical misbehavior, but may refer them to the principal's office more readily than in white schools. So this organization referral predisposition may similarly arise because of differences across schools and policies or teacher composition, for example, because of zero tolerance policy differences, which can reflect implicit assumptions about the racialized pathways for which students in minority schools are being prepared. Or it could be that teachers in minority schools may have more punitive or more tough love orientations. And then finally, there may be an interaction between the student's individual race, ethnicity, and their school's racial composition. So for example, a Black boy may be perceived as being even more blameworthy for throwing a pencil in a minority school than in a white school, or vice versa. So prior theory has really been mixed on this point. Some research suggests that the racial salience of Black boys in white schools may lead to their greatest perceived blameworthiness in white contexts, whereas other research suggests that their adjacency or proximity to Blackness in minority schools may exacerbate their perceived blameworthiness relative to a white boy committing the exact same behavior in a minority context. So as I mentioned, I'm taking a sort of video vignette approach to the experiment and the data that I'm going to share today. So to come up with the set of infractions that I feature in the video vignettes, what I did is I interviewed a diverse set of teachers to identify equally common incidents across student race ethnicity. I recruited actors and produced the videos with a professional director, cinematographer, and video editing team. And I did a bunch of within subject pre-testing of the actor photos and videos with what I refer to as a group of expert teachers. And I call them experts because they were informed about the study's purpose. And I was specifically using them to try to understand whether there were any systematic differences in their perceptions of the students' behaviors or sort of self-presentation that systematically correlated with the race or ethnicity of the student. Ultimately, we chose actors for whom the expert teachers told us there were no sort of differences in their perceptions of the behavior or presentation of the students, or whether they would refer the students to the principal's office. So the purpose of the videos is really to help mimic teacher experience in real life. And to be able to do sort of across Black, Latino, and white students, sort of present all of these sort of like very minute differences that when you're reading a vignette can often get lost because it's really hard to capture all the subtle sort of factors that can shape perceptions of behavior, even though we know these subtle perceptions make a huge difference in real life. So ultimately, the videos are able to do things like have the students wear the same clothes, have the same sort of behavioral presentation based on experience by the trained director who was helping train the actors. The actors are all sort of the same physical size, age, and their classroom composition is similar across all of the videos as well. And now you might be thinking, okay, well, we know that there's a ton of idiosyncratic factors that vary across students. So, how did you ensure that you didn't have a bunch of sort of idiosyncratic things about one actor driving the results? And the answer is that we ended up using multiple actors of each race and ethnicity. So the goal was that we would have estimates for each racial ethnic group in terms of how the students were perceived and referred by the teachers in such a way that they weren't driven by the idiosyncrasies of any one actor. So ultimately, we had 1,674 secondary school teachers in a stratified probability sample of 295 schools who were randomly assigned to view and describe and rate a video of a Black, Latino, or white boy. In the end, we came out with about 1,339, or 80% of the teachers completing the survey. And we had anywhere between 1 and 27 teachers per school, with a mean of about 5 teachers per school. And then at the end of the survey, teachers answered questions about themselves and their schools, and we linked them to school administrative data using their school's NCES ID. The survey lasted about 20 to 25 minutes, and teachers received a $20 gift card. And I want to just take a moment here and acknowledge the Princeton Survey Research Center, because they played a tremendously important role in helping do the recruitment for this study. So I was on the phone with Ed Freeland, who I think is on this call and who many of you know, for weeks on end as we were recruiting the sample and making sure we were sort of representative along a variety of dimensions. So a big shout out and thanks to Ed and to Nyla and all of the staff at PSRC for their tremendous help. Okay, so this is just to give you a sense that the sample teachers reflect the national averages on key characteristics. So you'll see here that the average school in my sample is 38% Black or Latino compared to the average at schools in the United States, which is 41% Black or Latino. Similarly, 45% of students in the average school in my sample received free or reduced price lunch compared to 48% in the US as a whole. So you can see that we got pretty close to sort of matching up on a lot of these key dimensions that we care about. You can also see this in terms of things around the urbanicity of the school, the grade levels that are taught at the school, the teacher's sex and teacher race, ethnicity, and so forth. So I'd love to just take about 30 seconds and just show you one of the vignette clips so that you get a sense of sort of what a teacher might have seen before they were in the position of having to describe the behaviors and make some decisions about what they would do in terms of referral. So immediately after seeing this video, they are taken to a prompt that basically asks them to briefly describe the student's behavior in the video. So it was from these responses that I generated inductively a qualitative coding scheme that really emerged from a race-blind qualitative coding process. So what I went in and did was, just not knowing the race of the student that the teacher had seen in the video, I started doing some sort of initial inductive coding of the text and came to realize that the responses sort of each of the tags that we created basically fell into one of three sort of buckets, right? So the first bucket was sort of blaming tags. These were things like the teacher would say the student was aggressive or arrogant, they're combative, they're a lowlife. Other tags were more neutral in nature. So they would say things like the student is angry, the student is antisocial, they slammed the door. And then the third set of responses or tags were much more empathetic in nature. They would say things like the student was experiencing anxiety, they were having a bad day, this was a call for help or a show of distress. And ultimately, I then had one Black, one Latino, and one white RA go back and independently code the responses, again, blinded to the race of the student, using the coding scheme I'd come up with. And we ended up with about 91% inter-rater reliability across the tags that were assigned by the RAs. So I was pretty happy by the sort of replicability and the inter-rater reliability across the coders. Ultimately, I averaged the scores, the number of tags that were blaming, number of tags that were neutral, number that were empathetic across each of the three RAs, and came up with a perceived blameworthiness measure, which is basically just a proportion of the number of blaming tags divided by the total number of tags that were assigned to any one given response. Teachers were then also asked if they would refer the student to the principal's office with a simple yes or no. And then we collected information on student race using multiple sources. So we used teacher reports in the main analyses. And we basically asked the teachers, what would you say the student's racial or ethnic background appears to be? And they were able to choose one from the following categories. And then we turned to the school racial and socioeconomic composition measures using continuous measures of the school percent Black or Latino enrollment and the school percent free or reduced price lunch enrollment from the Common Core of data through the US Department of Education. So we had the school NCS ID for every single teacher, and we linked that to administrative data from the Department of Ed. Because race and class are so highly correlated, all of the models include controls for the school percent free or reduced price lunch, in addition to the measure for percent Black or Latino, which is the substantive sort of focus of this paper. And then when examining the organizational level hypotheses, I used piecewise linear splines to capture some of the nonlinear effects of percent Black and Latino on the ratings by the teachers. So just to give you a sense here of what I mean by this. So You can see that there is sort of an exponential relationship here. And in order to figure out the best way to capture this, I did a series of sort of splines and ended up finding that there was not significant improvement in fit with more than 2 splines. So I ended up using the sort of most parsimonious model, 2 splines. And then in terms of determining the exact point of the knot, it turns out that it doesn't really make a difference if it's anywhere between 25% and 45% Black Latino. So I use the midpoint in these results and use 35% Black Latino as the knot location. I use multi-level models to accurately capture the error structure. So I use mixed effects, linear regressions for blameworthiness, and mixed effects logits for referral as the outcome. All of the models include school random intercepts to account for that clustering of teachers in schools. And then we include vignette fixed effects in all of the models as well. We either include actor random effects in the individual level models or actor fixed effects in the school organization level models, because in those models, we don't care about the individual student's race. We're in fact trying to net that out in order to capture the effect of the school racial composition. In the individual models, the controls are really not necessary due to randomization, but we use them to increase the precision of estimates. And in the organization level models, we use the controls and mediators to really unpack some of the organizational selection processes. Ultimately, we're able to compare the ratings of Black and Latino as compared to white boys by comparable teachers and comparable schools for a given infraction. I'll just show you briefly some of the controls we use here. So we have school level controls, student-teacher ratio, grade levels, urbanicity, and so forth. We have some controls that are measured at both the school level and the teacher level. I want to just call out in particular one of them, which is student behavior problems. So these were ratings by the teachers about the average level of behavior problems at the school, which is a really important control. And this is, when I say school, I mean the teacher's own school in real life. And I think this is a really important control because what it's helping do is rule out an alternative explanation, which is that there may just be worse behaved students on average in minority schools. And so we're controlling for that here. And then finally, at the individual teacher level, we're controlling for a number of factors, including the perceived race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status of the classroom in the video. So we're concerned that the presence of a focal Black or Latino as compared to white actor might shape the ways in which teachers fundamentally perceive the classroom scenario. And so we're controlling for those perceptions to try to help address some of that heterogeneity. And then we look at a number of potential mechanisms, the school discipline policies that I mentioned earlier in the talk, as well as teacher perceptions of the school surveillance and social control over students, and then organizational sorting and teacher selection processes based on things like teacher race, ethnicity, average years of teacher tenure, full-time teaching experience, and so forth. And then we're controlling at the individual level for all of the same things that we're using at level 2, which is the school level that averages across all teachers in a given school. Okay, so let's get into the results. So disentangling the first 2 hypotheses, individual blaming bias from individual referral bias. The first finding here on this first hypothesis is that Black students, on average, Black boys, are perceived as being significantly more blameworthy for the exact same behavior as either Latino boys or white boys. So really important sort of difference in across the full sample, the ways in which teachers are perceiving Black boys relative to Latino and white boys. And this is just to give you a sense that these results show up across a variety of different specifications and controls, which I'm happy to go into more depth on if people have questions later on. Then the second hypothesis was this idea that teachers may refer students of different racial ethnic backgrounds to the principal's office at different rates, even if they perceive them as being similarly blameworthy. And here you can see that in fact that is the case. Black students, Black boys are referred to the principal's office at significantly higher rates than white boys for the exact same behavior, even when teachers perceive both the Black boy and the white boy as being similarly blameworthy for that behavior. For Latino boys, the results are somewhere in the middle. They're not statistically significantly different from either white boys or Black boys. And again, you can see here that this result shows up in the third row here for the student is Black. across a variety of model specifications and controls. And really importantly, you can also see that this perceived blameworthiness score is significantly predictive of actual referral to the principal's office. So there's sort of this indirect pathway whereby Black boys are perceived as being more blameworthy for the exact same behavior. And as a result of that, that increased blameworthiness is then used to justify increased referral to the principal's office. But there's also the direct pathway, which I think of as sort of a residual pathway, which I mentioned earlier, where they're perceived as being similarly blameworthy, but still referred more readily. So there's both things going on at the individual level. At the organization level, we're just disentangling the blaming predisposition of teachers in minority schools towards students of all racial ethnic backgrounds from the ways in which teachers may perceive students of all racial ethnic backgrounds as being similarly blameworthy, but nonetheless, teachers in certain types of schools may refer students more readily to the principal's office. And here you see a very similar sort of story to what I showed you descriptively earlier, which is that when you look at schools that have at least 35% Black or Latino students, each percent increase in Black and Latino student enrollment is associated with a significantly higher probability of referral, significantly higher blaming score than is the case for a 1 unit increase in percent Black or Latino in schools that are predominantly white. So basically, higher levels of Black and Latino student enrollment are associated with significantly higher perceived blameworthiness scores, irrespective of the race of the individual student in the video. So just teachers in minority schools are more likely to perceive students of all racial ethnic backgrounds as being more blameworthy than their counterparts seeing the exact same behavior in white schools. And you can see that this shows up again across a variety of model specifications. So what explains this organization's blaming predisposition? So it turns out that there's a number of factors at the school level that play an important role. The first is, as I hypothesized, the presence of zero tolerance policies for a wide range of infractions. This is also true in schools where suspensions are allowed, even if they're discouraged. And then finally, the proportion of Latinx teachers at the schools, and in particular, those who have been at minority schools for a long time, end up being more blameworthy in their perceptions of students of all racial ethnic backgrounds. So in spite of this, I want to just put out a really important word of caution, which is that with the cross-sectional data that I have here, I really can't disentangle the causal ordering of these various factors. So it's really a chicken and egg problem. Do the teachers come first or do the policies? And I really can't speak to the order of that, but to say that these factors do entirely explain the organizational blaming predisposition, at least descriptively, at sort of in a very non-causal kind of way. And then the final hypothesis was about organization referral predisposition net of perceived blameworthiness. So this was the possibility that teachers in minority schools may perceive students throwing a pencil in class as being equally blameworthy as teachers seeing the same behavior in white schools, but may refer students more readily in minority schools. And the answer is that we're not seeing any of that fourth mechanism here at play at all. And you can see, again, that that holds up against a variety of model specifications. Of course, the perceived blameworthiness score remains highly predictive of referral to the principal's office. And then the final set of hypotheses were about this interaction, the possibility that that particular boys may be perceived as being even more blameworthy in particular school contexts. But as I mentioned, we don't have sort of clear guidance as to the direction of these effects, because in some ways you could imagine that Black boys would be most racially salient in white schools and thus experience the most blaming bias in those contexts. Alternatively, you might suspect that it's actually that their adjacency to Blackness in predominantly minority schools would lead to the greatest blaming. We don't really know. And so we turn to look at some of these results empirically. And what we find is that actually it doesn't turn out to be significant, these interactions. So it looks as though there could be something going on with Latino boys in predominantly minority schools. It turns out that those differences don't reach statistical significance, but you do see the same sort of overall picture here, which is that there's a larger gap in the perceived blameworthiness of Black boys as compared to white boys in more heavily minority contexts as compared to white contexts over on the left side of the graph here. And again, sorry for all the numbers, but the basic takeaway is that nothing in terms of the interactions are significant. This could potentially be partly a power issue, but substantively speaking, I can't make any claims about interactions being significant in this context. So just to give an overall summary of the findings. So this study uncovers organizational blaming predisposition as a new mechanism for the higher suspension rates of Black and Latino boys as compared to white boys. It's the first study to experimentally show that blaming perceptions also occur at the organizational level. And to just give you a sense of the magnitude here, moving from a school that's 0% to 100% Black Latino is associated with about a 20% increase in the chance of referral by the average teacher. I also find that Black boys face a double jeopardy. They're more likely across all schools in my sample to be perceived as being more blameworthy than white boys for identical misbehavior, and they're disproportionately likely to attend minority schools where teachers have blaming predispositions towards all students. So I think this work has some theoretical sort of implications. First is that this idea of an organizational blaming predisposition is consistent with a broad sociological literature on policing and surveillance in minority schools. But this is the first study to show that individuals in certain types of organizations systematically perceive and thus sanction identical misbehavior differently. It reveals that there's mechanisms of social control and cultures of social control in minority schools that can perpetuate what some scholars refer to as the school to prison pipeline. And even though few white students attend minority schools, this work provides a powerful counterfactual that indicates that today's racial disparity can't be accounted for by differences in behavior. And then in terms of the policy relevance, I think this organizational mechanism of blaming suggests the need for organization level policy levers. In terms of the work on bias, there's often an emphasis on individual level interventions, things like nudge interventions or anti-bias trainings or empathy interventions and so forth. And while those are incredibly important, as the results showed with respect to the presence of individual level bias among teachers, I think the organization level findings hold a lot of promise in terms of suggesting that there's ways in which we can intervene structurally or systemically at sort of a meso level in terms of things like using school discipline policy reform and other tactics to try to also address some of the disparate outcomes that we see for school discipline. And then also in terms of teacher selection processes. So I find that the proportion of Latinx teachers, especially those with high levels of teaching experience, end up being more blaming to students of all racial ethnic backgrounds than other types of teachers. Now, I think it's really important to note that this finding should not, in my opinion, be interpreted to say minority teachers are worse teachers or tougher teachers when it comes to blameworthiness. I think it's really important to pay attention to the selection processes that go into who stays in minority schools for many years. We know that teacher turnover, and particularly white teacher turnover, is a huge issue in urban schools that serve predominantly minority students. Oftentimes, teachers of color are the ones who stick around for a long time because of commitments to their community or other social networks and ties that keep them in those locations. And that it could be that if white teachers were to stay in these schools for equal amounts of time, they too would adopt some of the cultural orientations and policy sort of inclinations that permeate among the minority teachers that end up staying for a long time. So important to just sort of throw that word of caution that neither the teachers nor the policies are randomly assigned to schools. So we really can't make causal claims about the efficacy of these factors as policy levers. That said, I do think that this work has implications for schools and school districts. So increasingly, districts around the country are being cited and sued for human and civil rights violations because of these really stark racial disparities in discipline. And in these cases, school leaders are really on the hook to address the root causes among the adults in the school, not the students, and to use restorative models. So things like changing staff trainings or operations around hiring, school improvement planning, proactive legal compliance are all things that are on school leaders' minds right now. But before they can really target appropriate interventions, leaders need to be able to find ways to empirically assess the root causes of their disparities in a contextually dependent way. So to help provide this type of evidence, what I'm doing is I'm working with several school districts and the State Department of Education to sort of help work through how to use some of the evidence arising from the experiment that I showed you today, and then also the results for the administrator experiment, which I haven't shown you, to sort of think about transforming teacher and administrator, using the data from the teacher and administrator experiments to transform them into sort of a racial equity diagnostic tool that can be used to provide empirical evidence to districts to help them pinpoint the sort of mechanisms and potential policy levers driving their disparities. So in the sort of first phase of the work that I'm doing right now, I'm really just testing the racial equity diagnostic tool using 2 national samples of teachers and a sample of administrators to understand the drivers of the disparity nationally. And as I move forward, I'm going to be engaging in research practice partnership with a school district, actually several school districts, to use the racial equity tool to help provide evidence to schools and how they can think about tailoring their policy and practice intervention. And then finally, you know, a big limitation of the experiment is that we don't have data on like real behavioral decisions by teachers, right? This is all responses to things that they would do based on the video vignettes. And so what I'm really wanting to do is examine whether and under what conditions the patterns from the online equity tool apply to teacher professional practice using administrative data from the districts with which I end up partnering. So I will stop there and just say thanks so much. And a lot of acknowledgements go out to many people, including many people at Princeton. And I look forward to questions.
Okay, great. We're going to start the Q&A period and would like to start with a student question. So I will go to Gina first, and then Pat will be next, and then we'll go down the list.
Jayanti, do you want to stop sharing? So,
Yeah.
Perfect.
So Gina, you're first.
Awesome, thank you. Dr. Owens, this is great work. It's great to see you again. And I think I love the partnerships that you proposed. I think that's really interesting, and I'm eager to hear how that work goes with districts. I had a question about the coding into the 3 categories of some of those words. I was really struck. Antisocial doesn't feel neutral to me. And so I wondered if you did any, specification testing of, do you see, like, how strong is the connection between that neutral category or some of those words with some of the other outcomes you looked at?
Yeah, so what we did is, you know, and I should say, like, when I was working with the RAs to go back and redo this qualitative coding and apply it, you know, we had tons of these types of conversations. Like, does the word slam, is that really neutral? Like, is that just objectively explaining what happened? Or is that really more of a, a sort of blaming word, right? And so the way that we thought about this was that we went through, and for all of the words where we thought that they might be driving the results, we just dropped them from the analysis altogether. And we redid all of the, it was a simple automated procedure of just regenerating the proportion, but without those, you know, just one at a time, dropping each of those words that we were worried about and seeing whether the results change. So luckily it turns out that the results are not sensitive to sort of like any one of those words that could have been controversial, and it's, you know, what bucket it was placed in. And so that's kind of the way that we've thought about approaching it. But I'd love to hear if you have other ideas for sort of ways to go about that.
Okay, thank you. Pat, you are next. And we have a few more people on the list, but I think we'll probably have space for 1 or 2 more questions after that. So please do continue to put your name into the chat.
And we'll be very quick. Jayanti, good to see you. What I wanted to say is that I don't have a question, just a comment. You've lived up to the legacy of Diva Pager here. This is some of the best work that I've seen in years. This is just a triumph. Congratulations.
Oh my gosh, Pat, that means so much coming from you. Thank you.
I second that.
Was that Patricia? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Fantastic work.
Oh,
Third that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, no, and I truly say, like, this work has been inspired by so many of the people at Princeton who have played such a big role in my development. I mean, you can see from my acknowledgements, there's like Princeton person after another here. So thanks to this community in particular.
Thanks, Pat. Emma, you're next.
Hi, Jayanti. Nice to see you. I second what everybody has been saying. This is really, really amazing. So I have two quick questions. The first one is really, maybe I have missed this, but whether you could further disentangle the effect between Black and Hispanic boys, particularly you combine them together using a disproportionately minority school, but I wonder whether they will make a difference if it's disproportionately Black or disproportionately Hispanic, and whether it will make a difference if the Hispanic is immigrant or not. If you have the power to say that. And then the second question is, because your work is so policy relevant, so typically I wouldn't raise this question, but we all know there could be some difference in real life settings and in the experiment, and I suspect that the effect you found is probably like underestimated. So I wonder whether you have a sense of how big is the magnitude of the underestimation. Thank you.
Yeah, those are fantastic and very demographic questions, which I so appreciate for this audience. So in terms of separating out the composition, so you're totally right to say I collapsed schools that were, I was looking at sort of percent Black or Latino enrollment of the schools. And I believe your question was sort of, does it make a difference if you just look at percent Black or just look at percent Latino? That is an excellent question. And I have not, when I was initially making the decision to do Black and Latino together, I did do each of them separately, and I was finding that it was predominantly being driven by the percent Black at the schools, which kind of makes sense, I think, given prior literature and the work of people in this audience. But it turns out that so if I was just looking at Latino schools on their own, it would be a less strong story, but nonetheless, the direction of the story was kind of consistent. And then because of the sort of the ways in which we think of minority schools in the literature as being oftentimes Black or Latino, I ended up doing that. But I think it's a good point that I could separate them out and sort of show that as well. And then to the question about the percent immigrant, so in terms of the like CCD, the administrative data, I would need to go back and look, and maybe some people in this group know, like if their percent immigrant is reported as a characteristic of schools. If it is, I would love to do that. I think that's a fabulous idea. And I will totally circle back with you once I've done that. In terms of the actual videos themselves, one of the questions that we asked teachers was whether they thought the student was an immigrant, and if so, if they were documented or undocumented. And it turns out that just so few teachers said that they thought the student was undocumented, which could have just been, a social desirability thing going on, or it could have been that the classroom in the video, it comes across as being like a fairly like middle or upper class school potentially. And so, it could be that there was just assumptions made that the students were not undocumented there. But I think that, the sort of more exploration around the role of perceived immigrant status and real immigrant composition is a great sort of direction for this to go. And then the final question was, I think, about, remind me actually, sorry, I'm forgetting what the last question was.
Oh, the last question is more about the magnitude of a potential underestimation because you're doing experiment with this real life setting.
Yeah, okay, so the way that I've been thinking about this is that, and I'm curious to hear what you guys think, but the way that I've been thinking about this is essentially, so I got a bit into the psych literature around impressions and like the way impressions get made. And it turns out that like most impressions get made pretty quickly in initial interactions, such that like the video clips that I have would be long enough to capture those sort of like initial impressions and the way that they're made. And so what the research sort of suggests is that when you have a misbehavior, like an incident where the person in the position of power is perceiving the person and believes something went wrong, then most of the time those initial impressions get stronger over the course of further interaction. So actually we can think about these estimates as potentially being underestimates, as you said, because if we could drag out the video for like another, day or another, semester or whatever, and somehow, do an audit sort of situation, that we would expect that those initial impressions would get stronger. That said, I do think that there is a sort of important scope condition potentially to this work, which is you want to think about it as generalizing most to situations where teachers don't have prior knowledge of the student. So you want to think about times where it's the start of a school year, a new student in the classroom, a substitute teacher situation, situations where that prior history doesn't exist as much. yeah, that's sort of the way that I'm thinking about it, but would love to hear if you have sort of an alternate take.
Thank you.
Thanks. Sam is next.
Really quickly, just on the immigrant status question, I think that the CCD, for sure, federally, like each school reports recent immigrants to the either EdFax or CCD, and because basically like standardized test scores for I think it's 3 years. If you've moved here in the last 3 years, then you don't actually like count towards your school's average. And yeah, I wanted to echo everyone else and just say it's a really impressive feat. Like it's sort of a ton of work that seems like really well executed. My one question was about kind of the result that it seems like teachers are more likely to refer non-white students to the principal's office, even conditional on their blameworthiness. And I was just wondering about the blameworthiness variable. Basically, like, can you rule out the possibility that really this sort of for any given incident, blameworthiness is a continuous variable, and we've kind of got it coarsened by these 4 data points in a way that like it's just not explaining all of the variance. Basically, it's a measurement error issue. That's my question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, so the way that I've come to think about this, like I think of it as like the residual pathway, right? So if you think about the indirect pathway where there's student race shaping the perception of behavior, and then there's perception of behavior shaping referral, that's the indirect pathway, the blameworthiness pathway, right? But then there's that direct pathway, which is what you're talking about. So I kind of think of that as being the residual pathway, because it's for exactly the reason that you described, right? There's potential, it could be measurement error in the blameworthiness. It could be that the blameworthiness mechanism just in substance doesn't capture the entirety of the relationship. And I think that for conceptual reasons, there's a tons of reason to think that that's the case, right? I don't think that all of disproportionate referral is operating through teacher perceptions of blameworthiness, right? I think, as I mentioned in the talk, right, there's all these things about implicit assumptions about the likelihood of parental intervention, implicit assumptions about the likelihood of future misbehavior on the part of the student, implicit assumptions about the teacher's own ability to control the classroom, right? Like if you're a teacher in a school and someone, acts out and they're a student of color, you might be worried about your own ability to establish control in the classroom following that. So there's a ton of reasons that we think might not be captured through that blameworthiness pathway. And I think you're totally right to sort of call out attention to that.
Thank you. Patricia, next question.
Well, actually, I'm sorry, and I do not want to waste people's times. I just want to again reiterate how important this work is. I'm sure you're aware, but I was stimulated when Pat mentioned the name of the beloved diva pager, because I haven't felt an urge to steal figures and slides from anyone since she, as a graduate student, presented her pioneer research. And so if that is simply an evidence of how amazing I think this work is, beautifully presented, beautifully organized, very important theoretically, very important from the point of view of policy. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. That means so much coming from you, Patricia. Thanks so much.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions in the queue right now. So Jean, you're next.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. 3 quick things. One, make sure you go to a very high impact journal. And since Doug is on the phone, Doug, do you think this would make sense to send to PNAS? That's actually a Doug question. That's 1. 2, as you said, there is a huge literature in psychology on blameworthiness. And I'm just wondering if it would be useful before you submit the paper to review some of that. And that's blameworthiness for other things, not just in this case for behavior in the classroom. That also would be useful if you submit to an interdisciplinary journal like PNAS, because many psychologists read that as well. And third, I think I missed this. What was the percentage of teachers who fell into the 3 buckets? The blame, the neutral, I agree, neutral isn't really neutral, and then the empathetic.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So and so by the way, I might follow up with you offline about the psych references that you mentioned.
Of course.
Okay, great. For the blameworthiness, so really we were using a word-based tagging scheme, which is actually inspired by Brandon Stewart, who I think is on this call. And basically, you know, Brandon's work and around the structural topic models, right? This idea that you can, you know, use words or short phrases and qualitatively get much deeper sort of meaning around intent and sentiment than if you're using like closed-ended responses. So we were basically using that approach where we were tagging words in short phrases.
It's counts. All right.
It's counts. Yeah.
Right.
It's counts that we then turned into proportions. Right. But it's not like a holistic. So one of the things I talked a lot about with my RAs was this question of like, well, should we be doing like a more holistic scheme instead of a more objective, like, and I hate to use the word objective, but a more sort of like count-based occurrence. Should we be doing more of a latent sort of variable approach? And we decided to start with the count-based approach because we just felt that it was the most sort of defensible in terms of replicability. And when we did like a small sample where we did the more holistic coding, so then an individual teacher would get a score of like 1 to 6, for example, on like how blaming they were in general. There just wasn't quite as high of inter-rater reliability there. And so we decided to stick to the count-based approach.
Yeah. Okay. I see why you did that. One reason I'm thinking about that, well, there are a lot of reasons, but you guys have thought about a lot of them, is that, you know, since you put together the 3 types of words in the denominator, and then I'm thinking, gosh, what would happen if you had looked at the proportion is an outcome of the empathetic responses. My guess is those were much less likely to occur. And it isn't as though the blameworthy and the empathetic are mere images, because we have those problematic, angry, antisocial, which I would guess would be actually the most word counts would have been in the neutral group. That's just my guess. And so I'm wondering if somebody who is very highly empathetic, or at least did empathetic without doing the other words, what that would look like. You know, that looks to me like that would be the rarer case, the bad day teachers. But I'm kind of interested, would you get the mirror regression coefficients, or would they be really different? Anyway, so it's just something you probably don't want to do it, but it's curious I'd be curious personally. Who are those teachers that just said, oh gosh, that kid's having a bad day, right?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I mean, so one of the things that I didn't talk a lot about in the talk, but that I was like deeply concerned with during the analysis and the data collection was social desirability pressures in terms of you know, our teachers seeing, like, is it just so automatic at this point that you see a Black kid and you just assume that this is an issue of race and that you're going to get pointed at for being biased? And so I try to do a lot of stuff around the like way the questions were asked. So we often use this like third order. Actually, Susan Fisk was the one who like pushed this really hard. She said, you got to use this third order wording thing. Like, don't ask teachers what they would do. Ask them what should be done, like what would be done and so don't like put the emphasis on them. But she was saying like essentially they're going to be responding from their own perspective, because who else's perspective could they be responding from? So we did things like that, and then we did like there's a social psychology, they have this like short form scale for social desirability pressures. So we controlled for that in our models. But anyway, your point substantively is that, well, what, you know, it's one thing to control for social desirability pressures. It's another thing to actually try to harness these empathetic responses and understand like who are the teachers that are giving these empathetic responses? Are they doing it in part because they like feel like they're under the microscope, or is it that there's something about them that actually makes them genuinely empathetic? So I think I need to go back and just do more analyses with just focusing on, instead of the blameworthiness, as you're saying, the empathetic, and see what that is. I mean, I do recall doing some initial analysis there and finding that it's kind of what you would expect in that it's like predicts being less blame. It predicts less referral to the principal's office, for example. But the results weren't reaching significant levels, and I think it's because there was far fewer empathetic tags.
Yeah, right. Thanks.
Well,
Great paper.
I think we've run out of time for further questions. There were a few questions that were left in the queue. So Jayanti, if you're able to stay on for a few minutes, maybe people could ask the questions informally, but I would like to release the rest of you because we've reached the 1 o'clock hour.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to see you all, and thanks for the invitation to come today.
And Jayanti, this is Doug. I definitely think you should send this into PNAS.
Oh, goody. Great.
But of course, I can't serve as the editor.
Could Susan be the editor, Doug? No, probably not.
No, Susan can't be your editor either.
Yeah, that's
Mary Waters could.
Oh, that's good. Mary.
Okay, great.
Great job. Really great job.
Jayanti, it's good to see you. I do have a question. I didn't have a chance to ask, but when people leave, I do have a question I would like to ask you. But anyway, it's good work and it's good to see you. I guess you're at Brown. You didn't come in person.
I know. I'm sorry to miss you in person. I would have loved that, but we'll have to have you up at Brown again soon. Okay,
another time. My question is this. Actually, Patrick made a comparison of your study to Diva Page's auditor study. There was a difference. I may have missed it. I want to know how you have resolved the difficulty. The difficulty is that when you do resume audit, everything can be identical except race and criminal record. Everything else can be identical because information is limited in the resume. It's structured. Whereas in your case, a video is more holistic, and it's very hard to make everything else identical except race. How do you handle the difficulty?
Yeah. So the way that I was sort of thinking about this is that, as you said, it's going to be impossible to make everything the same. That's just not feasible. So what we tried to do instead was have enough actors of each racial ethnic background that any of those individual idiosyncrasies wouldn't drive the results. Because really what we're worried about is that these idiosyncrasies are systematically correlated with race, right? In such a way that they are then driving our results. And so what we did was we had like 4 actors of each racial ethnic background. And then we used the pre-testing with the photos and the videos to ask other respondents outside of our sample, are there differences across race in these performances, right? In this acting. And that was the sort of group of expert teachers that I mentioned, where we asked them, we told them, look, this is a study about race. We want to know whether there's systematic differences here. Please go through and tell us how you would rate these actors along these different dimensions that we care about. And it was using their responses that were not significantly different. So there was one actor. We initially had 5 actors of each racial ethnic background, but it turned out that there was one actor of each racial ethnic background who the expert teachers told us was like significantly different from the other actors. And so we ended up dropping one actor of each race and then had 4 actors left of each race who we used in the real study.
But anyway, this is one difficulty I find it because if you they always correlates with race. It's very hard to even the differences by race in the video. There could be subtle cues. But anyway, good study. Thank you. Thanks for giving me the time. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. And I'll definitely keep thinking on that. I mean, it's a tough one. Like, I'm not sure how.
Very tough. And you might want to think of a pre-treatment. I don't know. Yeah, it's tough. It's tough if you if you have evaluations on those, don't find differences, then expected differences after the experiment. So the treatment is really race, not any other treatment. So it's a tough one. So you cannot even out the pre-treatment differences because those are the differences you want to uncover. So it's very hard. Yeah. But anyway, I sympathize with your difficulty, but very good study. Very interesting. Very good. Okay. Good job, Jayanti. Good to see you.
Thanks. Great to see you.
Yeah, I'm taking off now. Goodbye.
Okay. Bye.